Thank you very much for coming, everybody. It has been said that the good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. It is in this spirit that this program has developed. These sessions are intended to inspire and create respectful dialogue and discussion about the issues and concerns of those in the LGBTQ+ community, and to educate those who may not know about such issues. LGBTQ+ are members of this and all communities. Each session, there are 4, will consist of a presentation of about 35 to 40 minutes. Some are in Zoom, some are live. Today is mostly videoed, followed by some questions, discussions, and snacks. All 4 sessions will be available both in person and on Zoom. We welcome everyone. We welcome those who wish to speak and those who wish to listen. We welcome those who wish to educate and those who wish to be educated. We welcome all who wish to begin to understand, those who wish to deepen their understanding, as well as those who understand well. The inspiration for this was a young girl in my previous church. She was 14, I believe, at the time, and she asked her rector if they would fly the pride flag. And the rector said, "It is not my decision, it is the decision of the parish, and we will go to a vote." And so Julia Whalen and her mom put together a 4-part series called Educate, Validate that was done only on Zoom before it went to a parish vote. And as a previous member of that, I saw this program and was really inspired by the energy and the effort and the commitment. And I really felt that it was important to carry that forward. So I am really, really grateful to Julia and Megan and Hal Rourke, the rector of that church, for doing that. By the way, the vote passed unanimously. I also have to thank Reverend Columba Salamoni, who is in the back. When I went to him to suggest this, it was all in, let's do it. Alex Andrasik, did I say that right? Andrasik. Alex is active in the Finger Lakes Justice Partnership, Keuka Compass, and throughout the community in his role as at the Penn Library. And truly, Alex is the mastermind. His support and his knowledge and his education has made all of this possible. And there are many others. Craig and Kathy Sandberg have been here and have been in the background. Steph Olson has been at all the meetings and has kept me somewhat on target, because my mind goes everywhere in the meetings. And all of you who choose to spend your time learning and participating. It is not without coincidence that we are starting this series today, October 11th, National Coming Out Day. National Coming Out Day was instituted in 1988 in the United States and is now recognized in Ireland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the UK. However, 34 years later, we are still seeking inclusion for the LGBTQ community and working to prevent bias.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Whalen. I'm currently a junior at Yorktown High School in Westchester County. My Educate, Validate seminar, which occurred about a year ago at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Granite Springs, is the inspiration for the event that's happening tonight. I wanted to share a little bit of my project's history so you can have a better understanding of the forces that brought us together. As my confirmation project 2 years ago, I wanted my church to fly the LGBTQ+ Pride flag on the last weekend of Pride Month, June of 2021. After some deliberation, I came to the conclusion that rather than just putting up the flag with low expectations for its impact, I would rather my confirmation project have a wider reach and help to educate my church family and others in the community about LGBTQ+ issues. That way, when we did eventually raise the flag, it would have a greater significance and deeper meaning for everyone in the community. It was then that I embarked on a long and arduous journey that I named Educate, Validate. To make our series of seminars happen, we endured 6 months of phone calls, emails, scheduling Zooms, marketing, planning, advertising, church politics, and writing countless speeches just like this one. It was a lot of work, especially for a busy high school sophomore like me. But the journey and the end result were very rewarding, and it's even more gratifying because it's being continued and added upon by this project. There were 2 tangible results from my own LGBTQ plus education project. The first is the well of knowledge and experiences that we created and shared with one another, as incredible speakers used their own voices and wisdom to help others come to new understandings of the LGBTQ plus community. The first seminar was on February 28th, 2022, and it was about history. We learned that LGBTQ plus people have been here for all of human history and will continue to fight for the right to be seen for as long as it takes. Next seminar was politics in March. Our speakers for this event included Honorable New York State Supreme Court Justice James L. Heyer, transgender attorney Kristen Prada-Broud, former Yonkers City Council Majority Leader Michael Sabatino, State Senator Peter Harcum, Consumer Protection Director of Westchester and Republican Jim Maisano, and former Austining Mayor William Hanauer. In this seminar, each politician spoke for 10 minutes, giving listeners the message that LGBTQ plus individuals and issues must be treated equally and fairly by the law, and showing that public advocates have worked tirelessly over history to bring about the rights that the community has today. The seminar about people was the third one, and it was held in April. Individuals from all different walks of life came together to share their varying experiences with the LGBTQ plus community in an open and heartfelt setting that helped broaden the perspective of many attendees. You'll hear some of these stories at your seminar tonight. The final seminar was led by Bishop Mary Glasspool from the Episcopal Diocese of New York. We were so lucky to have her share how LGBTQ plus issues relate to the Bible, the Episcopal Church, and to God. The second and the more spiritually inspiring result of Educate Validate was the impact that it had on the people who attended and their loved ones. For example, before this seminar, my grandmother was barely able to talk to our family since she was disturbed and deeply upset by my coming out. But she was determined to at least try, and so she attended all 4 seminars. This led to several deep family discussions and her eventual acceptance of my identity. An older man who had previously struggled to understand the trans community enthusiastically informed us that our seminars helped him embrace and feel empathy for transgender people. A person at our church who didn't think they'd live to see the pride flag raised in Granite Springs found the strength and confidence to come out to our rector after many years in the closet. There are more stories that we may not have heard yet, and many more to come, thanks to your seminar. Oh, and we did end up raising the pride flag with a service and party in June. And it still flies over our rector's house today, and it will return to the church flagpole every year during Pride Month. Unfortunately, in the modern world, and even in New York, not everyone has the ability or willingness to be proud of themselves and of their loved ones. That is why we must continue to spread love, acceptance, and pride for ourselves and for our neighbors in any way that we can. The reason that the celebration of the LGBTQ+ community is called Pride is because pride is the opposite of shame. We are not ashamed of ourselves and of our identities and of our LGBTQ+ family members. We're going to be who we are and embrace all without exceptions. I'm so humbled and honored that my idea of LGBTQ+ educational seminars has grown beyond one church and will continue to touch lives. I wish you a great seminar. I thank you for having me and for putting in the effort to make your town a more loving and accepting place.
So the question is, what is the importance of coming out? Why is it a day that is celebrated? And I think there are as many answers as there are people to whom you ask that question. But I believe it is seeking the life that each of us is meant to live. It's not living in silence. It's not living in solitude. It's not living alone. It's living in love and laughter and enjoyment of the unique self that we each are. Something every one of us, regardless of our sexual orientation or identity, can identify with. Thank you for coming.
Welcome to St. Mark's. This is week 2 of the Acceptance, Belonging, and Community series. This week we're talking about LGBTQ history, and we've brought in the wonderful Gerry Szymanski from Rochester.
Hi, everybody.
Who will regale us with very interesting things this evening. So,
Gosh, I sure hope so.
well, I know you will.
Sure. I thought I would introduce myself first. I'm Gerry Szymanski. I live in Rochester, New York, and I work primarily as a librarian at the Sibley Music Library at the Eastman School of Music, which is part of the University of Rochester. So I work right downtown. It's the largest academic music library in the Western Hemisphere. It takes up an entire city block. It's really sort of a musical playground. I'm also an assistant or associate adjunct. Yeah, I keep giving myself that. I wish I was all those. I'm an adjunct professor at Eastman. I teach in the musicology department. So I teach courses in library research as well as in concert repertoire. And I've been there for about 25 years or so. But I'm here to speak to you tonight in my capacity as the librarian for the Out Alliance, which is a volunteer position I've held for about 15 years or so. And in that role, I have learned quite a bit about the history of our area and the history of our area in terms of LGBT people. And so my talk today is called Upstate Queered, or Some New York State Gay History. And that's me. So I'd like to start with acknowledging somebody from your neck of the woods. Have you heard of the Public Universal Friend? I was not super surprised to see that only 400 feet away from this very room is the Yates County Historical Center, which has lots and lots of information about the Public Universal Friend. And this person who arrived here in this area in the 1770s as Jemima Wilkinson became ill, went into a coma, and when they woke up, found themselves to be genderless, beyond gender, and did not sort of acknowledge either male or female. And as such, this person has become a real sort of progenitor for a lot of trans folks and folks who consider themselves non-binary, and lived here until 1819. Their experience, her today, I guess you could say, was in 1776, the year of the American Revolution. But for the next 45 years, they were a they, if you will. And there's been some very strong interest in the Public Universal Friend through two different sources. One, a popular podcast, and two, a very recent book. And the Public Universal Friend lived in Jerusalem. I don't know if anyone has ever passed through there. It's only 7 miles away. I would like to go there one day and see what it's like, and check it out. So our area here has this name. It's called the Burned Over District. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. It's a term that describes religion. And it was actually given to us by a guy named Charles Finney, who was a great evangelical preacher who came to our area in the 1830s. But by the 1850s, 60s, 70s, he said that all of upstate New York was, quote unquote, burned over because most everyone had been converted to some religion or another. And some of the religions that have popped up in this area have been the more mainstream ones. This Episcopal Church being one, the Presbyterian Church there, the Methodist Church. But some have been unique things, such as the Oneida Colony, Mormonism, the Shakers, who actually lived in central New York. And you see here on this particular map that they actually point to the Public Universal Friend as sort of being a little bit before the burning, maybe even at the very start of this. My friend Kristen Roth Allen, who's across the street at the Methodist Church, probably would say, well, the Methodist Church isn't doing this so much anymore. It's not so fire and brimstone-y, but they were famous for their camp meetings and all sorts of evangelical things where they would just draw hundreds of people. It was really kind of a wild time of religious fervor. And when we get to the mid-century, around 1850, there seems to be this almost coalescing of not only spiritual things, but also social things. Now, this is the time period of, sailing ships and steam, telegraphy, all sorts of inventions happening, railroads. And Rochester, which is where I'm from, which was the flower city at the time, was really starting to pop. The Erie Canal had passed through about 25 years before, And the Genesee River was a conduit for all sorts of crops. And so you had this kind of interesting intersection of the Genesee River flowing north with all this traffic up to Lake Ontario and the Erie Canal going east and west. And it really became this incredible boom town. It was just like this sort of nexus. And it had people that lived there all year round, and then people that came and showed up on the canal boat and stayed for a while and got on a canal boat and left either direction towards Buffalo or Albany. The waterfall right in the city center allowed for all these different mills. And so there was all sorts of work. It was like a real extension of the Industrial Revolution. And you started to see some, wealthy people showing up, just going down Main Street. I saw houses like this in Penn Yan. I was like, wow, look at that. These Greek revival places. In Rochester proper, right near the river, right sort of near the corners of the main streets going north and south and east and west in the city itself, these two fellows, a fellow named Abelard Reynolds and his son William Reynolds, built a beautiful building. And this was sort of a community center for Rochester. It was called Reynolds Arcade. And that very center part that you see here with the mansard roofy part was actually an open space with windows. And so it was this really cool space inside. And here's an image of what it looked like in the 1850s. And then here's a photograph of what it looked like a little bit later. But it had all these, floors and all these offices. The post office was there and all that. And it was kind of like this bustling nexus where you sort of pass through there every day on your way to something else, almost like you would have as a shopping mall today or some other sort of, city nexus. Well, these guys realized that there needed to be a place where people could really sort of sit like this and have maybe a meeting or a lecture or a musical performance. And so they created something they called the Athenaeum Hall. And you see it there as the second thing on this list. And this is what it looked like in an steel engraving. You'll also notice that it says Athenaeum Building on the bottom, but it says Corinthian Hall at the top. And that's because inside the large space up on the second floor, which was kind of one big room, there were these Corinthian columns. And here's an engraving of what it looked like inside. So it was this really beautiful, large room that had these huge windows and the columns in the back. And here's a banquet taking place there. It was really it became sort of the place for Rochesterians to kind of get together and talk about things or hear a musical performance. It was a little bit, pulled away from the churches. So maybe there's some secular things, but there were also religious things. This is where the Mechanics Institute and the Athenaeum Club themselves got together. And they got together and became the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is kind of cool. Here's another image of the inside of this incredibly cool hall. This space became the nexus for an incredible amount of social movements in the 1850s. It became this intersectional place of spirituality, suffrage, abolition, and temperance. The building was built in 1848, and in 1849, just a year later, these three young women, two younger girls and an older girl, demonstrated spiritualism for the very first time. Here you see Kate and Maggie Fox. They had a spiritualist experience at their house in Wayne County in Hydesville, New York. And they came to Rochester on the behalf of an abolitionist woman named Amy Post and did all sorts of knocking and rapping and tapping and communicated with the dead. So they said, the Advent of Spiritualism, 1848. And you see on the right-hand side, this book that says the story of the Rochester knockings or the Rochester rappings. And of course, there was some pushback as this being, a terrible thing. And other folks felt that it was, a thing that was okay, because in the Bible, we actually have people communicating with dead people. There's the witch of Endor, in the book of Samuel. And this is also when seances kind of started kicking in. And this became a worldwide religion. And it really had its spark in Rochester. A couple of years later, here's the Rochester Athenaeum and Mechanics Association having their meeting. I got a chance to take a look at this meeting book. This is from 1851. This is the book at the Rochester Institute of Technology's library in their collection. And who are they inviting to come and speak as one of their lecturers? Ralph Waldo Emerson. I wish I was as famous as him coming to speak to you guys. I'm no Ralph Waldo Emerson, but yeah, that's a big deal. You know, the guy who wrote Walden Pond and all sorts of different books about transcendentalism. You know, this was really a thing that was starting in the 1850s. I also want to tell you about this musical family, the Hutchison family. They came from New Hampshire. And for a while, they had these beards. And in the 1840s, they had mustaches. And that was kind of a weird thing because almost all the guys in the 1840s had chin beards. I always say Amish people look like 1840s. If you look at daguerreotypes of guys from the 1840s, they all have chin beards and no mustaches. So it was kind of scandalous for them. And they were this family of singers. They were sort of the Von Trapps of the 1840s, if you will. And you see some of the fellows here, you see some of the guys, and some of the girls. This is their big song that they sang about New Hampshire. They were very proud to be from the old Granite State. And then later, here's an image of them, most of the fellas in a daguerreotype. They welcomed Jenny Lind to town, to America, and they were also friends with Frederick Douglass because they were very strong abolitionists. They believed in ending slavery in the United States, and this is their advertisement for their concert in 1851. And they talk about singing temperance songs, peace, liberty, temperance, and general reform. And I love this part. They're charging 25 cents to their concert. Women, 12.5 cents only because her rights are not yet recognized and her wages only half what they should be and what they will be in the good times soon coming. So you had folks like this passing through and performing at Corinthian Hall. The very next year, you started to see temperance things happening here. The drink problem and its solution. There were these almanacs you could buy, these anti-drinking almanacs. Even Walt Whitman got into the game with this serialized story that was in some newspapers that was called Franklin Evans or The Inebriate. There were all these temperance groups, including the Daughters of Temperance, who were the sort of the female version of the Sons of Temperance. And who were the Daughters of Temperance? Well, it was these folks, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and their friend who wore pants, Amelia Bloomer. These are all folks that you know of, but they were all doing these things. And of course, temperance was very closely related to suffrage. Women were really trying to improve their lot. Their husbands were often drinkers. You know, there's been some studies about how much people drank in Rochester based on how much, liquor went through the canal. And people drank a lot of alcohol in the 19th century. If you see up here, it says the 20th of April, 1852, large group in Corinthian Hall, Rochester, New York, and the Women's New York State Temperance Society, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, president, Amelia Bloomer, corresponding secretary. And Amelia Bloomer ran a magazine out of Seneca Falls called The Lily. And you see over here on the right, a little bit from The Lily, and it's Susan B. Anthony, a secretary for this, And so this was very, very much a huge part of what was happening, not only here, but it was like centered here. It was centered on that space. And here are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. later. Also in 1852, Frederick Douglass spoke at Corinthian Hall. He's been getting a lot of press lately, which is great. There's a new PBS series about Frederick Douglass. There's been quite a few books about him recently. Here are some daguerreotypes of him. So some pictures from the 1840s and early 1850s. I had a chance to see this second one, the one on the right. This was a daguerreotype that Douglass gave to Susan B. Anthony. And she had it as like a keepsake, and it's pretty cool. This is Sir Isaac Julian, a British artist. He does video installations and art, and he came to the Memorial Art Gallery with his exhibition over 10 different video screens about Frederick Douglass called Lessons of the Hour. He was just knighted by Queen Elizabeth in June, just a few months before she died. So this is what the installation looks like. And the screens were like, they were like going together, and then sometimes they would do a different thing. And there's some great pictures. All of it was narration of Frederick Douglass's words. And in 1852, Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches ever, which is "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And he gave it in Corinthian Hall. There's lots of really beautiful pictures from this exhibit as well. It's been cool to see how this has changed from a 10-screen thing to a 5-screen thing to a 1-screen thing. Isaac Julian has really been able to sort of make it this cool thing. And in this video, he and his wife actually go get photographed by an African-American photographer, which is super cool. And they also had these very large tintypes of the 3 characters, the photographer, Douglass, and his wife. And this is how big they are. And they were very beautifully lit. It was a very, very cool thing. Frederick Douglass set up his Northern Star newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper in Rochester. And as we know, as things got closer to the Civil War, he actually became a close advisor to President Lincoln. But it was there at Corinthian Hall where he had his sort of first great abolitionist triumph. Also that year, the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison showed up. He was the founder of the Anti-Slavery Society. And I love this. This is Sojourner Truth. And I love this because we're in this church that has, the 10 Commandments in the stained glass window. As she was returning home from the house of Amy Post, and Amy Post is the lady who brought the Fox sisters to Corinthian Hall. One evening, after having delivered a lecture in Corinthian Hall, a little policeman stepped up to her and demanded her name. She paused, struck her cane firmly upon the ground, drew herself up to her greatest height, and in a loud, deep voice deliberately answered, "I am that I am." And that's, of course, what God said to Moses at the burning bush. The frightened policeman vanished, and she concluded her walk without further questioning. So, yeah, it was great to have her visit there. All right. So what about the gayness of all of this? This is a book that I love. It's called Pages Passed from Hand to Hand: The Hidden Tradition of Homosexual Literature in English from 1748 to 1914. And I'd like to read you a quote from a fellow who's a friend of mine who he just posted this today. And I thought, this is perfect. To study queer history is to scavenge for pieces of us, to compensate for a lack of records by finding cracks where queer light might come in, to read between lines, to find irregularities. What we lack in historical data, we have to make up in imagination. We're in there somewhere. And there is a little bit of historical data. I'd like to talk about this fellow a little bit. You may have heard of Nathaniel Hawthorne. You may have had to read The Scarlet Letter in, 8th grade. Author of The House of Seven Gables. His books were coming out in the 1840s and 1850s. And you may have heard of this fellow, Herman Melville. And you may have heard of his book, Moby Dick, published in 1851, dedicated to Nathaniel Hawthorne. Why was it dedicated to Nathaniel Hawthorne? Well, that's because they exchanged a series of love letters. This is from a website from this year, which is kind of a cool thing. And the second story in here is actually by Herman Melville. And in the preface, every single little excerpt or story has a whole blurb about the author, and it talks about how Melville was smitten with the older Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, Melville lived in New Bedford, which is the whaling capital, but he also lived in Western Massachusetts, very close to the New York State border, near Pittsfield, and he lived in a house that had a name. It's called Arrowhead. And in the last year, there has been a production of a play based on their letters. And these two fellows were actually performing, reading from the letters of both Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. So that's Hawthorne on the left and Melville on the right. And I love this picture of them in front of Arrowhead. And so here we have people from this time period, from this mid-century period, who are starting to sort of express their queerness, maybe privately. This guy, maybe not so privately, Walt Whitman. He was a newspaper reporter, kind of an itinerant carpenter, and, edited the Brooklyn Daily Eagle for a little bit. But in 1855, he came out with this book, and it created a total sensation, Leaves of Grass. Here's a picture of the first edition, published in Brooklyn, New York. Here's the famous frontispiece of this. And of course, Whitman was not sort of afraid, at least in his first edition, to express some homoerotic things in a way that nobody really was doing in American literature. In his very long initial poem, which became Song of Myself in later editions, he says, "Loaf with me on the grass, loose the stop from your throat. Not words, not music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best, only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice. I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned me over and parted the shirt from my bosom bone and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart and reached till you felt my beard and reached till you held my feet." It was quite a thing for this to pop on the scene and for him to be sort of kind of an unknown, and for people like Ralph Waldo Emerson to notice him, and suddenly everyone noticing him. And this fellow in the United Kingdom also noticed him, a fellow named Edward Carpenter. This is a book about Edward Carpenter, and it's a biography, and I love the title. It has its dates, 1844 to 1929, and the subtitle is Prophet of Human Fellowship. This guy was quite a character. And when he read Leaves of Grass, he sent Walt Whitman a letter, and he said, "Because you have, as it were, given me a ground for the love of men, I thank you continually in my heart, and others thank you, though they do not say so. For you have made men not to be ashamed of the noblest instinct of their nature. Women are beautiful, but to some, there is that which passes the love of women." Edward Carpenter actually had 2 different boyfriends, and people knew about it. And here he is living at the same time later as Oscar Wilde. Now, Oscar Wilde got sued by someone who was a member of the nobility, and that's why he ended up in Reading jail. But this guy, Edward on the right there with his beard, and this is his younger lover, George, they lived together in a little village. They worked together. They had a garden. And Edward ended up becoming a very political person. He was the founder of the Labor Party, which, depending on how things go for Liz Truss, might be taking over pretty soon. And then here's a photograph that shows Edward actually with his former lover on the left-hand side. And these 2 guys, the middle and on the right, lived together until one of them passed away and the other passed away a year or 2 later. He was a vegetarian. He believed in wearing sandals. He was really quite the character for this time. And here's a blurb from one of his letters where he actually says, what I just read to you there, this is on the Walt Whitman archives. All of the letters that survive are actually scanned. And so here's a scan of one of the letters that Carpenter wrote to Whitman. And he actually got to meet Walt Whitman. He came to the States and spent some time with him and started writing about what it was like to be gay. He started writing all these different books about gay people in history. He started writing about trying to figure it out, trying to sort of place gay people in society. It wasn't until the late 1860s that the word homosexual was actually first used in a publication. So move ahead just a little bit. He's written a book in 1908, and in 1923, this man, when he was a younger fellow, found a book in the library that he was working at, a public library. He was a child. He was actually a page, and it was called The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. And he took it out and he read it and he realized that what Edward Carpenter was describing about being homosexual was what he was. Harry Hay went on to become the founder of not only the Mattachine Society, but a group of gay folks called the Radical Fairies. The Mattachine Society was one of the very first pro-gay groups in the United States. It was founded in 1950. And of course, if you know your history, that's around the same time that Joseph McCarthy was doing the House Un-American Activities, going against communists, going against gay people. They started to meet in secret. They wanted to try to improve people's perceptions of homosexuality, of people being gay. And this is a group of the guys from the first group at a Christmas party. Here's an article from a blog in Buffalo. Beyond Stonewall, the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier and Gay Liberation. There were chapters all over the United States, and they were kind of like little secret-ish societies, but not so secret because they actually had a magazine. It was called the Mattachine Review. Now, what is a Mattachine? Well, a Mattachine was a French dancer who was kind of like a jester in the courts in the 1700s. And they were able to sort of say what they wanted, just like a jester could. Between their Mattachine Review and their magazine called One, and you can see this is from 1958, they started to change people's minds. There was also a group of women that got together and founded a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. And they formed in 1950. They formed in San Francisco, and they were formed by Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin. And they were the first couple that were married by then Mayor Gavin Newsom in San Francisco. Their house is now a historic site in San Francisco. And this is a later issue of their magazine called The Ladder. All of this was happening because of Harry Hay, because he had read Edward Carpenter, who had corresponded with Walt Whitman. In Rochester, a year or two after Stonewall, there was this advertisement in this school paper. Take heart, brothers, gay lib is coming. And it wasn't just brothers, it was also sisters. Here are some of the founders that met up that night and started a gay group at the University of Rochester in their campus center, which was Todd Union. We're lucky to have some of these color photographs of some of these people. This guy is still with us. His name is Whitey, the guy in the red shirt. Here's another founder. Her name is Karen Hagberg, and she lived on my street. And for a while, she worked at the Sibley Music Library, which I think is pretty cool. She was a piano teacher. She's still with us, too. They became a chapter of what was known as the Gay Liberation Front. It was a much more radical group than the Mattachine Society. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. They saw that Stonewall could make people change their minds about homosexuality. They saw that there was power in protest. The Mattachine folks wanted to sort of ease in. Whenever they would have a protest, everyone would wear a suit, or they wouldn't talk. They would just maybe carry a sign. Whereas these kids, these college students, this is right when the anti-Vietnam War stuff was happening, right when the civil rights movement was, at its peak. There was all this stuff. The ERA movement was happening. And you started to see them, showing up at different events with a table. They were tabling, if you will. I love that poster. Look at that. Look at that crazy font. Gay love. And they came out with their own sort of little newsletter chapbooky thing too, called The Empty Closet. And this is the very first issue. And, you look at the next page and you see that fist. And, that symbol that you don't really see too much anymore. Gay power. The world is what you make it. Let's make it together. Come out. And, they had some articles that were written by people that were part of the group. You can see here they talk about the Cornell Gay Liberation Front. Cornell had a gay liberation front and Buffalo had a Mattachine Society, and Rochester was kind of in the middle, and it didn't have anything until these kids got together at the U of R. You know, manifestos. There was a bookshelf. We'll talk about that later. But I just think it's amazing that in the first issue of this little magazine, there's a bookshelf. They're talking about all their events. They're having a dance. There's a calendar. You know, thoughts on gay liberation, thoughts on Allen Ginsberg, the poet from Howell. You know, they're getting together with folks from Buffalo and Ithaca, which I think is really cool. You know, and they have their 5 freedoms. It's almost like, you know, what you read, you know, this sort of like this list of things. And some of them are like what Norman Rockwell painted, you know. But yeah, it's pretty cool. Power to the people. Well, the empty closet kept going and kept going and kept going. And it went all the way until 2020, which is kind of amazing. It became a newspaper on newsprint. You see here sort of in the middle here with color. And then it became a magazine. And the empty closet, all the past issues have been digitized and are now at the University of Rochester's digital repository, which is super cool. Here's an issue that has a kind of a saucy headline. New York Pride Parade climaxes Gay Pride Week. And you see here on the front page, this photograph of people from Rochester holding a banner. Gays from Rochester joined 43,000 others. You know, it wasn't called the Pride Parade right away. It was the first year after Stonewall. It was called the Christopher Street Liberation Parade. And then very soon afterwards, it was called the Pride Parade. And I love how it says parade, because this has been a debate in communities that have a parade as to whether or not, you know, it should be a march, should it be political, should it be, you know, or should it be a parade? So should it be celebratory? And a lot of places try to have it be both. One of the guys from the Rochester group had actually moved to Nebraska, but he came back all the way to New York City so that he could participate in this. And they're wearing their gay love shirts. You can see that font, and they're holding signs and walking. And it was a really cool thing. And so you see folks going down to New York to celebrate what had been this important observance of Stonewall. But they also marched in Rochester. You can see this is on South Clinton Avenue. The Xerox Towers on the left. There's a Universalist church there. That's where Susan B. Anthony went to church. Fight back to end gay oppression. And of course, that's turned into the Pride Parade that we have each year in Rochester. There's actually a gay band in Rochester that plays in the Pride Parade. And it's become one of the largest events. And I think one of the coolest things that ever happened in my own personal life is when 2 college friends of mine who I went to Houghton College with, who were very conservative when we went to college and were kind of upset with me when I came out and didn't talk to me for a few years. They are now going to an accepting church, and they marched in the Pride Parade this year. And I was like, oh my gosh, you know, here's a Presbyterian. I'm sure there are Episcopals in there too. And the city has started to take notice. And now there is like a declaration of Pride Week. And our Pride is actually not in June. A lot of places don't do it in June. Atlanta just had their Pride celebration. Montreal does it in August. A lot of places do it in June around the same time as the Stonewall events. But ours has always been in July. And so people are always wishing me a happy Pride in June. I'm like, thanks, but like in a month and a half. So there's usually a big event afterwards, but ours is in June because of this event, the Rochester Gay Community Picnic, which started out as just a bunch of folks saying we should have a picnic, and contacting the bars. There were lots of bars in Rochester at the time, and having a get together, and then it became an annual thing, to where it is now an annual thing, and it's a big fundraiser, and lots of folks come. And they do it at Genesee Valley Park, or they do it at Cobb's Hill Park. People bring their dogs. It's become a thing. And that's what our Pride is sort of centered around, was this community picnic that was totally separate from, a commemoration of Stonewall, if you will. The Alliance also, the folks that were part of the Gay Liberation Front were actually asked to leave the University of Rochester campus because most of the people had graduated and they weren't like a student group anymore. And so they had to sort of figure out what to do. And for a little while, the gentlemen and the ladies actually split up. And the women founded a group called GROW, Greater Rochester Organization of Women. And the men founded a group called the Gay Brotherhood. And the women were on Monroe Avenue in this beautiful building that used to be a firehouse. And the men were in an unheated building on the other side of town. And, I think Creature Comforts had helped them get back together. But they grouped together. And as you can see, this is a pretty hippie place. Community Vocation, Social Change, Holistic Health Education Center, Pottery, Cricket Press, and then the Gay Alliance. You had to walk up a bunch of stairs to get up there. But this was like the sort of first co-community center. And it was even called the Community Center. And this is where the Alliance was generated as like a newsletter and then a magazine and a newspaper. And the building is still there. It's now taken over by the Flower City Arts Center, and they do printing. They still do pottery, and they do photography, which is cool. As the 80s moved on, the Alliance actually bought their own building, which is pretty cool too. The Gay Alliance of the Genesee Valley. Rochester was also home to lots and lots and lots and lots of gay bars and clubs, some of them even before Stonewall, including ones on Front Street, which was right near the river. It was this very old part of town. All the buildings were from the 1840s and 1850s, and it was all torn down in the 1960s with urban renewal. But that was like, the sort of part of town that you went to if you didn't want to be seen, But the Bachelor Forum, which still exists, some of these places, of course, don't exist anymore. Bars go through very quickly. I had a friend who told me that everyone called the red carpet the rude rug. So with the piano vocal stylings of Polly Van Dusen, Jim's Great Gatsby, there were bars that were for women like the Allen Street Club and Rosie's. And so you saw these sort of gay spaces popping up, not just the community center, but these actually gay businesses that catered to gay folks. And then, of course, with the onset of HIV/AIDS, you started to see Rochester chapters of folks that were part of ACT UP, which is a national organization for New York City. There were marches, there were parades, there were sit-ins, there were demonstrations. Yeah, and the AIDS quilt actually came to town, and there were people from Rochester that were on panels that were part of the quilt. This is when it was being shown, I think, in the Bausch and Lomb Center. And there was somebody playing the harp, and this is someone from Rochester who had passed away. And Rochester really stepped up. They started to raise money for AIDS research and to help AIDS people with AIDS, including Dining for Dollars, which was an event where you had dinner at people's houses, and then you all went to Midtown Plaza for dessert. And there's some photographs that we have of Midtown Plaza full of folks. And of course, there were medical organizations that started up, AIDS Rochester and Community Health Network, which was run by Dr. Bill Valenti. And they merged just about 10 years ago to become AIDS Care and have since become Trillium Health. And it's still there. And they have now services for pediatrics and gynecological services and drug treatment services. It's become a full service organization. This guy, whose picture you may have seen there as one of the founders of the GLF, went on to have a really cool career. He was the very first city council person elected in Rochester who was gay. He was a teacher by profession, and he was out. And in the 1980s, that was a big deal. In fact, it was a really, really tough thing for him. He just passed away last year. He later moved up to become a superintendent. He worked near Jamestown, and he worked in the Hudson Valley, and passed away just about a year or so ago. He was followed by another gay guy who was a city councilman, and yet another gay guy. Now we have a straight guy in that same seat. But it was kind of cool to have this succession of LGBT people. We also have a gay assembly member, Harry Bronson. Here he is waving. And I think it's really cool to have, we've had a series of gay politicians because a lot of places do not have that. We've also had folks in the religious sphere that have been very influential. Jamie Spar, she was going to become a Presbyterian minister, and the denomination wouldn't let her become a minister. They said no, like at the last minute, they're like, nope, she can't be a minister of your downtown United Presbyterian Church. And so they still hired her, but they paid her to be a goodwill ambassador to create what is now the More Light movement across Presbyterian churches. This guy, Reverend Jim Callan, was kind of a breakaway Catholic priest and allowed women to speak from the pulpit and from the lectern to serve communion. Working with Mary Rammerman, they actually were excommunicated. So, this church still meets. This called Spiritus Christi. And here is Bishop Matthew Clark giving a mass to some gay folks. So that was a really significant thing in the religious world happening right in Rochester. I don't know if you know, but Rochester seems to be headquarters of the drag movement. This is Ambrosia Salad performing at the Former Mothers. This is a photograph I took of her being held by some firemen. Aggie Doon. These drag queens actually travel all around and they come around here. They actually perform a drag brunch at like wineries and different places. This is Mrs. Kasha Javis. She had a documentary about her. She was featured on RuPaul's Drag Race in a season and is actually there now as part of the All-Stars. And Darian Lake also was on the show and is now part of the All-Stars. There was a gay film festival that was founded 30 years ago. This is its 30th anniversary. It just ended on Sunday. It's Tuesday. It just completed its 30th year. It started out with just as a couple of videos and a couple of projected movies with a 16 millimeter thing, and has grown to be this huge, huge festival. It is the largest film festival in New York State outside of New York City. Here's a director friend, and it draws everybody, draws huge crowds. And it's since expanded to become an art exhibition each year. It hasn't happened in a little bit because of COVID, but it's called Image Art and usually takes over a gallery with LGBT artists, local as well as national. And there have been awards and prizes. This was when they had people send in postcards that you could purchase, which is pretty cool. And they've also created a literary journal called Image Outright, and it has been coming out for the past couple of years, an edited journal, which is pretty cool. Our Gay Men's Chorus was actually founded 40 years ago, which is amazing. And they're still kicking. They just had an event this past Sunday, their spaghetti dinner, and they're going to be having their 40th season coming up starting in December, which is pretty cool. And the activism that was generated in the 1840s and 50s by folks like Susan B., by folks like Frederick Douglass, by folks like the Temperance has really translated into contemporary people. And these two ladies that you see right in the middle there, Anne Tischer and Bess Watts, really, really worked hard on getting marriage equality in New York State. And here's an article about them. And they make all these really great signs that are very clear, good font, they have really good handwriting, lots of great colors. And in fact, this picture of my friend Todd holding up this sign became sort of emblematic of the entire marriage movement. Here it is in an article in the New Yorker by David Remick, Obama and Gay Marriage from 2011. They have been really, really active. And here's a protest, and this is outside of the Monroe County building right down in the city of Rochester. And it drew hundreds of people, and it was so cool. I took these photos right here. And everybody got, they either brought their own sign or got a sign from Ann and Bess. And it was very wonderful to see all these folks. Now, New York State was ahead of the game from the United States. We all know that the Supreme Court decision of Obergefell versus somebody is what, made it legal throughout the United States. But in other places, like Iowa, Hawaii, Vermont, it was already legal on the state level. And in New York State, we were really trying to get it to be a big deal because we have so many people in the state and because New York is so influential. And, this picture is pretty problematic. It's a lot of white guys of a certain age and I'm a white guy of a certain age. I'm as old as all these guys, but there are no folks of color in this picture, and there are no women. But what I think is cool about this picture as a Rochesterian and as a Central New Yorker is that there are 6 people behind Governor Cuomo, and Harry is from Rochester, and Lieutenant Governor Bob Duffy is from Rochester, and Jim Alisi, who's a Republican who voted for the gay marriage and actually didn't run again because he knew his constituents would not vote for him again. 3 of the 6 people are from Rochester, which I think is super cool. Yeah. I don't know if you know this lady, Madeline Davis from Buffalo. She was a musician and kind of hit her stride in the 1970s, kind of a folky type, maybe Melanie or Joan Baez, but as a lesbian, she was singing songs about women. And this is one of her cassette tapes from 1983, Daughter of All Women, original songs by Madeline Davis. And one of her songs on side 2 was the song called Boots of Leather. And she actually ended up writing a book called Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, The History of a Lesbian Community in the Buffalo Area with another author, Elizabeth Leprosky Kennedy. And it ended up winning the Lambda Literary Award from the American Library Association, and it was published by Penguin Books, which is pretty amazing. She was a librarian at the Buffalo Public Library, and she started amassing a huge archive of gay stuff that happened in Buffalo that is now at the University of Buffalo, Buff State. She just passed away last year at the age of 80. And her analog, if you will, in Rochester is this lady right here, Evelyn Bailey. She just passed away in July. She founded an organization called Shoulders to Stand On. And Shoulders to Stand On was the name that she gave to the documentary that she created, a documentary about Rochester gay history. And I thought I would actually show like a really short 2-minute clip from this documentary. It's like a teaser, and hopefully that'll work. I think when we tested it earlier, the sound was working just fine.
People have a rather unique relationship to the world insofar as we're invisible.
Many brave women and men chose, sometimes with a great personal sacrifice, to be visible.
We were bringing a major source of pride to the community.
It's always had a strong sense of social justice.
I don't think it's something we became. I think it's something that we are.
We're really on the front lines of the movement.
This is who I am. This is me. We still have barriers reaching out to the community.
This community has always taken very good care of its own.
I was actually on the committee that helped create the documentary, and we kept meeting like every month for like 5 years. And then suddenly we were filming it. It was like this crazy thing. And then it was screened as part of the Image Out Festival. And then it was screened again at the Little Theater. And then it was shown on WXXI TV. And there are copies that are part of the Monroe Library system that you can check out on DVD and Blu-ray. So it's really pretty cool. And I'm in it for about a minute talking about the Mattachine Society as a talking head, if you will. But it's really been a great thing to be part of, talking about, how did this community, get to be, in doing all this research, Evelyn found that people had all this paperwork at their house, all this stuff that they saved from whenever they were very involved with the organization. And as such, she kept saying, what am I going to do with all this stuff? What am I going to do with this box of papers from the film festival, or a box of papers from this organization that doesn't exist anymore, like business meetings and flyers and things. And she realized that it needed to be saved. And so unlike Madeline Davis, who was saving it all at her house, Evelyn discovered that she could apply to some grants to the New York State Education Department and get grants to have this stuff be housed. And so she's sent things to the Rochester Public Library, to Cornell University. I will talk about them in just a second, to University of Rochester, to Brockport, and created an event called the Rainbow Dialogues, which is an annual event which brings people in to a space where we connect them up with the archival material. And this past year, it was at the Memorial Art Gallery because it was connected to the HIV/AIDS posters that were there that are part of the University of Rochester collection. And so that was pretty cool. But it's been at the public library, it's been at a couple of other locations, and it's been really, really cool to connect people up with this stuff. I also helped out with this project called Forging Alliances. These are huge panels. They're like, you guys don't have like giant banners here, do you? Well, it's like, they're like almost as tall as a screen. They're these big vinyl panels that are all about gay history in Rochester. And as you can see, there's a whole ton of them. And they've been displayed all over the place. They've been displayed at Pride. This year, the Monroe County asked if they could display them in different county buildings, and that's pretty cool. And I was on the team that helped to create them. I scanned all of these pictures. And helped write the text and found a graphic designer, and they're really, really cool. It's been a really cool thing to have created about LGBT history in our area and have it go around. And it's gone to churches. It was at the public library for a while. In June of this year, Evelyn was actually honored with a whole bunch of proclamations from the city, from the county, and from New York State. You can see some of the people holding the proclamations there. That's Evelyn in the red in the wheelchair there with the flowers. And this was at the county building in Rochester, New York. And I took this photograph. And within a month, she had passed away, which is really sad. Because, she felt like her work wasn't quite done. But what she did do was she set up a foundation, which is a part of the Rochester Friends and Foundation of the Public Library. And the hope is to hire a part-time archivist just to work with the LGBT materials, which I think is going to happen. I think it's about halfway funded. It takes a while for these things to get up to a certain level, and then you have to get off the endowment and all that. But yeah, so even in her passing, she's made it a promise to the community to keep, this stuff preserved. I mentioned Cornell because they actually have in their rare and manuscript collections a huge collection of LGBT materials, the Human Sexuality Collection. It was founded by Bruce Fettler and David Goodstein, and David Goodstein was the founder of the Advocate newspaper, which became the Advocate magazine, which is still around, has a strong online presence, and is still something that people can get in the mail, I think either every month or every 2 months. And has a massive, massive collection. And the Out Alliance, which is the successor to the Gay Alliance, actually sends our institutional records to Cornell. So we do have things being split up a little bit. And that's like one of the things about when you sort of take care of history, like where does it go? We would have loved if there had been an institution back in the 1980s who would have taken gay stuff. But at the time they weren't. They weren't taking gay things. And so we found this collection at Cornell to send our things to. Now, all of the institutions in Rochester that house archival historic materials are gay friendly. And that's really pretty cool. I also take care of the Out Alliance Library, and I've been doing it for 15 years. And some of the things in the library collection go all the way back to the Gay Liberation Front, to that list of books in the very first issue of The Empty Closet from 1971, which is kind of crazy. There's always been a collection of books and materials at the center. And since I've been monitoring it, it has grown and grown and grown. And we actually have, this is half of our special collections. We have some of those homophile publications from the 1950s that are as rare as hen's teeth. Some of them only were published in runs of like 200 or 300. We have magazines and newspapers from other places. We have pulp fiction. We have all sorts of cool stuff. And then we have about 10,000 books, 10,000 plus now. Books, DVDs, videos, all LGBT related. Either the author is an LGBT person or the subject is LGBT. it's really an astounding thing. Since this photograph was taken, we moved to a new location. We're hoping to open up in February of next year. This time when we moved stuff, we moved each bookshelf individually, and we took everything off each shelf and put it in numbered boxes. And then we went down the street and we unpacked it and put everything back on the shelf, which is a lot of work. And there were 27 of these shelves that you see. 10,000 plus things is a lot of things. So, but I'm part of preserving not only some of Rochester's history, but also all of LGBT history through things that people have written, things that people have, put together, as a newsletter or a magazine or a video or a musical recording. I maintain the catalog. I take care of this whole massive collection. And yeah, the collection at Cornell is really big, but it's at a, Ivy League university. This is the largest collection of LGBT materials, apart from Cornell, in all of New York State. Like, it's bigger than the collection in New York City. Like, way bigger. They have like 5,000 things. So it is really awesome. And it's been a lot of fun to be able to take care of it and to be able to learn about this history and to be able to learn about the very peculiar history of my town that I live in, which is, pretty influential even over to here, and how the way that people were in coming out and being socially active is totally a descendant of all of this activism in the 19th century, where in that time, 100 years, 120 years before, people were trying to make the world a better place. And, in 1970, a bunch of gay people decided that they needed to do the same thing. And I think that's just really super cool. So that's my spiel. And I hope it was okay.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I something came in my head as you were speaking, and I should have asked you this before, but I'm off camera. But if I'm in front of that, I'll be blinded.
There's no print on this. So
that's fine.
You can stand there.
That's fine. Well, I was speaking with Bishop Lane this afternoon, and he gave us a little bit of our own sort of Episcopal Diocese of Rochester history, that in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, there was a priest, Walter Szymanski.
Yes, no relation.
Okay.
But it's spelled exactly the same way.
Yes. So he had actually done a lot of organizing around what became the homophile ministry in this diocese. So we're talking 50 years of history, even in our own church. Yeah. So just to highlight that in addition.
Oh, really?
There you go.
Oh, wow. How cool is that?
I'm in this church.
No, yeah. I've been asked that a lot. And, growing up near Houghton, people have always asked me if I was related to Mrs. Szymanski, who was a music teacher in Livonia. And I actually met her at a music conference once. And I was like, everyone thinks you're like my aunt. She's like, well, it's my married name. I'm like, okay, cool. There was also a photographer in Rochester whose last name was Szymanski, but it was a homonym. It was Cemanske. So everyone thought we were related too, even though our names were totally spelled differently, which is kind of crazy and fun. But yeah, I know Evelyn was speaking to Walt as well. And I'm not sure if she was able to secure his stuff or if it went to the archives of the Episcopal Church, but I need to start adding him into some of my things. I never got to meet him. I don't know if he's still with us.
I just looked through our convention journal, and the last date he was included was 2013.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but
he might actually, he's the kind of person who might actually have a page on Wikipedia.
Probably.
So. I don't know. I'm not sure where he's from. Yeah, and I'm originally from the Buffalo area. And for a while, there was a whole page of Szymanskis in the Buffalo phone book. So it was not like a super uncommon name. So, yeah. Yes.
Who was the author of that sort? Who wrote that book?
I think when I described the Public Universal Friend as beyond gender, that was my own comment on on their life. They were sort of beyond gender. Oh, but there is a book, and I will go back to that slide so you can see the book that that was on there. Oh, and that's off there.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
sure.
switched it off just to.
But I'll
with
read
balance.
the. Oh, boy, I had 197 slides. I didn't realize it was that many. It is actually called The Public Universal Friend. That's the title of the book, The Public Universal Friend. And you're right, Peter Moyer. Paul Moyer. Paul Moyer. Nope, that was just what I called. That was just what I was sort of how I was describing The Public Universal Friend. But Beyond Gender sounds like a great title of a book. So
we do have a question from online.
okay.
Do you have a sense of how Rochester LGBTQ history compares to other cities of size with regard to groups, publications, marches, population acceptance, et cetera?
I think, comparing to like, say, Syracuse, because, especially in the 70s and 80s, Buffalo was much larger. It was the Queen City. It was the second largest city in New York State. And I think Rochester was fourth or fifth then. But I think, kind of balanced out with like Syracuse. And they don't actually have a gay community center. As far as I know, they have not had a publication that lasted for 50 years. As far as I know, they haven't had too many gay people in government. I haven't really heard of any church, things news coming out of there. I mean, there's certainly gay people there, of course, and they probably have a parade and they have a pride too. They have CNY Pride now. It's sort of all encompassing of, central New York. But, they're a city that's just down the road and it doesn't seem to have the same kind of the pop. So I think Rochester is unique. I think it is different. I think it does have something in the water. I think there was a report in one of the censuses, because some of the censuses have actually just described same-sex couples and others haven't. But Rochester was like the sixth most concentrated, gay place, which you wouldn't think, Provincetown is like number one. It just is, it's in all these other places like New York and San Francisco and, Palm Springs and WaHo and all that kind of stuff. But Rochester was like up there. And I was like, what? This is crazy. There's a lot of people, same-sex people cohabitating. Now they might not be married. They might just be partners. They might just be whatever, folks want to call themselves, but I just thought that was really fascinating that, even the government like notices that it's a gay place. And even all the stuff that Madeline saved, I just don't think it represents as much activism, because one of the things that happened with the Mattachine societies is right after Stonewall, those all just kind of petered right out, like within a year or two, because the gay liberation fronts and the student groups were so much more active and so much more, in your face and just sort of, not just sort of milk toasty. And all of those homophile societies just stopped. And so, in Buffalo, that's what they had. They had a Mattachine society, and then it wasn't, They have had a community center there. And for a while, it was unconnected to their newspaper magazine, And so they were like two separate things. Like the newspaper magazine was more like a business, like if you had a Finger Lakes magazine, whereas in Rochester, it was concentrated as in the community center, and some places their pride parade is put on by somebody else, not the community center, I mean, in Rochester, it's only been in the past 5 or 6 years that the pride parade has been concentrated more on a center. It was always run by this group of volunteers called the Business Forum, and the picnic was actually run by the community center. So if you have if it's a little bit more disparate, I think it's a little tougher to get people together to be activists, and if it's a little more concentrated, especially, it's still a pretty small population compared to the general population. And not everybody participates in political action or activism or outedness. Not everybody goes to the gay film festival, they are like, oh, that's happening this week. Yes. It's the 30th year. You should have gotten an email. Oh, I guess I saw something on Facebook. Not everybody comes to that either. What's I think different about the gay community is that people sort of have to find it, and they have to sort of choose to be part of it. If you're part of the Polish community, it's, part of your upbringing. It's your religious background. It's the language that your grandparents spoke. It's the food that you eat. It's the words that you say when you say, chachi and babci and, jaji for your relatives. It's, the traditions of the things that you do at Christmas. And it's sort of like, you're built into that, but when it comes to the LGBT community, a lot of it is a community of choice. And you're choosing to be with people that feel the same way that you do and have experienced some of the things that you have, but it can be a little bit more of a rougher transition, and it can be a little bit more fractious. Not that every community doesn't have some fractiousness in it, but some people, like I said, they're like, oh, this has to be a march. And they'll be like, no, this has to be a parade, and you have to try to find some common ground. Because people have different viewpoints about, even an event like that, should it be, protesting and, political signs, or should it be, yay, we're happy to be here, and that can, you've heard of churches that, split because somebody wants blue hymnals, somebody wants red hymnals, but when it comes to organizations where you have people coming from a lot of disparate backgrounds and a lot of different age groups, older people, younger people, the younger people that you all saw that were part of that group, they were all students at either the U of R or the Eastman campus. There were at least two folks from Eastman that kept coming over, a guy and a girl that kept coming over to the Gay Liberation Front. And, they were totally a different generation from the closeted people who were just going to work, would maybe go to a gay bar once a week on Front Street, and they were not out to their families. And these kids were like out. And for 1971, that was a big deal. It was a huge deal. And, you saw some friction, and of course, as those folks got older, they started to have friction with younger people or people who wanted the organization to go to a different way. Or, one of the things that happened with the gay organization is it became a nonprofit. And that was a really big deal because at the time, the city wasn't going to give them nonprofit status. And there were city council people who said that they were not going to vote for an organization that promotes a particular brand of sexuality. And they were the people in power. And they were able to get money through CETA. I don't know if anyone even remembers CETA from the 70s, through an African-American man who was in charge of the Urban League, and he became Rochester's first African-American mayor, actually, Bill Johnson, and he was able to secure money through CETA, and instead of the United Way, which said they were denying the Gay Alliance money, he was able to get money to them through that. So that changed when it became a nonprofit, because then it couldn't be so political. Then it had to become more of a service organization, and all these sorts of things that make it, different from when it started out. And of course, all groups and organizations change and morph and move one direction or another. Since I've been there, they've had a huge youth group and then a small youth group, and they've had a seniors group and not a seniors group. And it just sort of there's sort of this flow, if you will, of what, but the idea of the community having some sort of a common core and coming together for all these different things, like the chorus, like the film festival, like the parade, like the picnic, is still there. And in a way that it's probably a lot more fragmented in other cities and not so concentrated, not so communal, if you will. I think Rochester really has something special. So, yeah.
And we've oh.
It's usually the second week of July. And I think they've been doing it all in one weekend. They have the parade on Saturday and the picnic on a Sunday, and for years they would split them up. So there'd be a whole week, the parade one week and a picnic the other weekend. But I think they're both doing it together. So it's usually I think this year is like the 8th or 9th of July. So it all depends on how the calendar flows. It's usually the second weekend of July or the first full weekend of July. Yeah.
We have a few other questions from folks in the audience that were submitted to me. I know you can't really see me over here, but I'm hidden behind the screen. I also just want to kind of start by saying that I really appreciated the way your presentation conveyed the importance of passing our stories down through time, and the importance of there being sometimes that one person who first comes out to be that torchbearer. In your narrative, it was Walt Whitman, and the way his coming out, if we want to call it that, a little bit different than how we think of it today, doing it in a major publication like that. But the way that inspired the next person, which inspired the next person, you can draw that line. Yes. And being a fellow librarian, I love the role that the library played in that, and coming right off of Banned Books Week as we are. It's no wonder that certain forces want to try to take certain books out of the library, because the things that let us know all and of what and who we can be are dangerous to certain ways of thinking. Oh, totally. So really great to see how that, a library got involved in the good trouble of launching that.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is exciting.
But one of the questions from the audience has to do with the LGBTQ politicians that you mentioned in Rochester. What do you think having so many out politicians in recent history from the 70s onward, how has that influenced the culture? How has that influenced the society of Rochester? Has it made it a more accepting place? Has it not really had that much of an impact?
I think it's I think when they were elected, they were certainly pushed back by other conservative members of the community. I'm sure they got lots of hate mail. In fact, Harry Bronson, who's our assembly member, and was the first, LGBT person in the assembly from upstate New York, still gets hate mail at his business, which is a little coffee shop called Equal Grounds. But I think for overall, having them be visible, having them sort of be a face, and having them, be the person that the reporter asks a question after the city council meeting, and just showing up and doing their job, showing people that, they're no different in terms of the person that they can be to serve the community. A lot of these fellows were elected 2 or 3 times to city council, and Harry Bronson's been elected a whole bunch of times. He was, I think he was in he's the assembly member, but I think he was also in some other government position. I think it's visibility. I also think that they do affect policy. I mean, Tim Maines, the guy that you saw as the teacher, spoke to Mayor Johnson and said, "Look, we should start to offer benefits to same-sex partners that work for the city of Rochester." And so they actually passed a law in city council, and the mayor was at the meeting, and he said he would sign it the next day. And the next day before he signed it, he had a whole bunch of ministers showing up at his door in City Hall saying, "You can't sign this. These people are sinful." And he said, "Look," he said, they're and these are his words. And I say this because I interviewed him as part of Rainbow Dialogues. He said, these folks are in as hard of a place as we were in the 1960s. We can't discriminate them, just like they can't discriminate against us. We have to support them. And that was really tough for him, because it was mostly African-American ministers that were speaking to him about not signing this into law. I showed you those 2 ladies, Ann and Bess, who were all about marriage equality. Well, I didn't tell you this. They both worked for, or at least one of them worked for the Monroe Community College. And the community colleges, I don't know if you know this, but they're like part of the SUNY system. But they're also kind of, almost every community college has like the name of the county it's in. So they also have like influence by the county. And she wanted to get some spousal benefits. And at the time, she couldn't marry her spouse, and it was before marriage equality was passed. but this was her, domestic partner. And she said to the, administration at MCC, Monroe Community College, I'd like to have, benefits for my partner, just like a married couple. And the county executive at the time, Maggie Brooks, said no. So they brought a lawsuit against the county and against SUNY. And the judge ruled in favor of Bess and Ann and the entire SUNY system. Every state university and every community college in New York State had to then offer spousal benefits to domestic partners. So, I only had an hour and a half. But, I want to let you know that was the thing that those two ladies did. Then they kept going to push for equal marriage in New York State. And made those signs and got in the New Yorker and yada, yada, yada. So, that's another Rochester thing that, that wasn't happening in Syracuse. That wasn't happening in Buffalo. It wasn't happening in Albany. I wanted to mention another librarian, Barbara Giddings. She was a librarian who was part of the Mattachine Society. And many years before Stonewall, there was a Mattachine protest on the 4th of July at Philadelphia at Independence Hall. And it was a bunch of folks who wore their suits and ties and the women wore dresses. And they carried signs that said, homosexuals are people too, treat us right. And they walked around and they did it for like a half an hour. They didn't say anything and they left. And she was one of the people who was part of that protest, a pre-Stonewall actual protest. There were other ones like sip-ins. There were sit-ins during the civil rights movements, but there was a sip-in where a bunch of gay guys went to a straight bar because there were laws against serving homosexuals. Yeah, and they protested against that. Barbara was also one of the people who helped get the American Psychological Association to change their ruling of homosexuality as a mental illness or an illness in their diagnostic manual in 1973 or 74. And there's a picture of her with Frank Kameny, who is also a Mattachine person, sitting at a table with this man wearing a mask who was a psychologist who was gay, who actually came out, without coming out by telling everybody, I'm at this conference and I'm gay and we need to change this. She was there. She was part of that. She was the first person to create an LGBT roundtable at the American Library Association. And they're the people that give out the Lambda Literary Award. So, librarians have had a really great part in even in recent history with pushing for social change. And, when she passed away, all of her stuff went to, I think it went to the Library of Congress. She had so much stuff that she and her partner rented the apartment next door, and it was filled with all of their LGBT stuff, which is kind of crazy cool. Frank Kameny stuff went to the Smithsonian. Some of the archives from Rochester, the people with AIDS, the Helping People with AIDS, HWPA, who did the Dialing for Dollars, the event with the dinners and all that stuff is now at the Smithsonian. So, when your national institution of record is looking at Rochester and saying, this is a very significant thing that you did, and it needs to be remembered and part of our national fabric. I think that's a really cool thing. So yes, Rochester is different. I don't want to be, claim it too much, but it is super cool to be part of this and sort of be, I didn't experience a lot of those things, but I've been there long enough that I've experienced some things and have been part of some historical things and helped out with the documentary and helped out with this and that. And now I'm helping with the library. So it is pretty cool. Now, are there any other questions?
We're gonna do one more question. We have several more great questions, but we just don't have time for all of them.
Well,
but there's a chance to chat afterwards if you can stick around. But we want to cut off the Zoom right at 8:00 so people aren't hanging on. But this, about 5 minutes if you can answer
I might be able to
this.
squeeze a couple in.
We'll see what happens.
Okay.
So one person writes that LGBTQ people of color were at the forefront of the Stonewall uprising. Is there anything you can say about the roles and experiences of people of color in Western New York's LGBTQ history?
Yes. There have been a few spaces that have sort of popped up that have sort of catered to folks, but probably the biggest thing that developed, especially with the AIDS epidemic, is that it really influenced and affected a lot of people of color. And there was actually sort of a separate sub-organization that was founded really to help folks, culturally and just sort of to be able to sort of be there for them. And it's called the MOCA Center. And it's an outgrowth now of Trillium Health. It's a branch of Trillium Health, but it really serves the African American community, the Latin community. I think that the community could sort of do better in including folks. But right now our board of the Out Alliance has 2 Latin American folks and 1 African American fellow, and a combination of men and women. I think, because it started out as being college students and almost all of them are white, but at the same time, it was also pretty equitable with men and women, which was also unusual for organizations at that time. They were, very kind of segregated, I think that, especially in the past couple of years, the Empty Closet has been really making sure to focus on BIPOC communities and making sure that they're represented. And there's also a Black Pride that happens in Rochester now too, kind of a separate auxiliary event, which I think is really cool. So, yeah.
All right, and we've still got 3 minutes. Maybe we can squeeze one more in.
Yeah, I'm like trying. Okay, how can I answer that concisely?
And so, do you have anything you can say about what you've seen about the history of LGBTQ people in the military?
A little bit. One of the guys that came to visit Rochester in the 1970s was a fellow who had been discharged from the Army and ended up on the cover of Time magazine in the 1970s. And he came to town because Anita Bryant was coming to town. And he was leading protests against her. He was kind of following her around the country because she was very anti-gay and she was having these rallies against gay people. And he wanted to make sure that there was another voice. I'm trying to think what his name was. It was like, private somebody. But he appeared on the cover of Time, and a lot of people knew who he was as sort of the gay soldier. One of the guys that was a city council person, Bill Pritchard, had actually served in the military and was very outspoken about gay people being able to serve with dignity. And, we've had people come and speak, like other soldiers, and like Margaret Kammermeyer. So.
According to the Google, that would be Leonard Matlovich.
Yes, Leonard Matlovich.
You beat me to it.
Yep. And I believe his gravestone says something like, they gave me a Purple Heart for killing a man, but discharged me for loving a man. I don't know if there's a picture of his tombstone in the Wikipedia, but yeah, like even after he passed away, he was like an activist, which I think is pretty cool.
Oh, well, okay. One more question,
Okay,
and we're right to the end here. Do you know anything about local indigenous attitudes towards gay, LGBTQ, or Two-Spirit members of their communities?
Yeah, I actually know a Two-Spirit person who's a gay person who's my friend on Instagram, and I met them in person a few times. But I don't know if there's like been a real super strong connection between all these things that I've told you about and, some of the indigenous communities in town. And I think there should be. It would be really cool to I did follow Mr. Jemison once at an archives meeting and talked about the library. This was like 15 years ago. So he knew of our existence, just as we knew about his work with Ganonigan and, his family lineage being descended from Mary Jemison from Letchworth State Park way back when. Like that's like 1790s, but yeah, there doesn't seem like to be a super strong connection, but I would love to explore something like that. I think it'd be really cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the questions, audience, and thank you so much again for your presentation and all your wonderful answers. Thank you so much.
Oh, I really appreciate it. It was such a delight to be able to be invited. So thank you again.